Urbe and Astra bonus episode 1.
Hello, welcome to the Urbe ad Astra podcast, where we talk about the craft of writing, history, science fiction, fantasy, science, and other nifty topics.
Hello, I'm Jo Walton, science fiction and fantasy writer and vocateur reader.
And I'm Ada Palmer, also an SF novelist and a historian of European thought, censorship, books, the Renaissance, and lately, all the things that resulted in Michelangelo not finishing stuff.
And today we're going to ramble about history and the craft of writing because this is our first test.
Yes, testing hosting a podcast for the first time and seeing how it goes before we actually inflict this on a friend guest with all of our not knowing how the tech works. So usually we plan to have a different guest for each episode, and we will talk with that person about a different topic. And we have a range of people that we're excited to invite, but for this opening one, we're just going to have a conversation on our own, as we often do because we're good friends, about writing and narrative and constructing narrative. And hopefully it'll be a good taste of the kinds of things we'll talk about with a wide range of people we know, some of them researchers, some of them authors, some of them in other walks of life. So Jo, why don't you introduce, we want to talk today about complicity in narrative, and I think Jo could do a good job introducing it.
So, complicity is where the author gets you on the side of the narrator or the characters where you wouldn't necessarily expect to be going along with them. And probably the easiest example of this is Richard III in Shakespeare's Richard III, where Richard gives his soliloquies to the audience. So even though he's telling us what he's going to do and that the things he's going to do are awful, he draws us into complicity, into going along and sort of almost wanting him to succeed in what he's going to do, because he is telling the truth to us. He's turning to us and telling us his plan. And he becomes charming in his grotesque way because he is drawing us in. And if you see an unsuccessful performance of Richard III, it's where it's been cut or he doesn't succeed in getting us almost on his side with the complicity thing.
Well, and another example that's extremely similar, well, at first it's going to feel extremely different, is in Roadrunner and Coyote Looney Tunes cartoons. Because frequently when the Coyote is setting up some kind of complex trap for the Roadrunner, and then the Roadrunner we know is going to thwart the trap, the directors will be very careful with how this is shown to the viewer, how much eye contact each of the characters makes. And so, for example, there can be an iteration of this repeated, there's going to be a trap, it's going to fail, in which we watch Wile E. Coyote at great length, setting something up, and he maybe makes eye contact with the audience. You know, he pulls the exciting gizmo out of the Acme box, and he looks at us, and we make eye contact over how excited and elated he is, and we see him meticulously put it together. And in one that is directed like that, our complicity begins to move to be with him. And then we feel sort of sympathy as well as humor when the thing fails. If, on the other hand, we're watching him in a more distanced way, and the cartoon swaps intentionally between these things, and the Roadrunner comes up and the Roadrunner makes eye contact with us and raises an eyebrow and gives us a smug smile. You know, even though none of them says anything, there's no dialogue, it's actually just body language. The director of the cartoon can decide, for this shot, we're going to be in deep complicity with the Roadrunner because we've been watching him move slowly toward the Coyote as he's been making eye contact with us. And inside, we are emotionally with the Roadrunner for that shot, or with the Coyote for the other. And it's entirely focused. The exact events that happen in the sequence can be identical, but the way we're shown it and whose point of view we're drawn into being in sympathy or in complicity with is different. And if you've ever watched a Coyote and Roadrunner cartoon that you felt was kind of meh and was sort of just mostly repetitive, it'll often be because nothing interesting was done with Complicity in that one. They just had them go through the motions without thinking hard about which one the viewer is being positioned to think about more at which moment. And it can hand your Complicity, a skillful director or writer can hand your Complicity back and forth between, rivals or enemies or different characters, or nested in one place or nested permanently another, or not work very hard with it, and different narratives are served by different stuff. So Richard III, Coyote Roadrunner cartoons, very similar in how much they both depend for their success on succeeding in getting the audience's Complicity to be where the director wants it. And an unsuccessful production of Richard III, or an unsuccessful iteration of a Roadrunner cartoon, often fail for the same reason, even though they're so incredibly different from each other.
That's a brilliant example. I would never in a million years have thought of that example, but now that you say it, I can absolutely see it. That's perfect. That's exactly what it is. And the other moving arts example that always comes to mind is the original House of Cards.
Yes. The original UK House of Cards, which has you go, Jo.
No, I was just going to say the actor, exactly as in Richard III, Francis Urquhart, who is a horrible, terrible person, is always honest with us. He addresses the camera. He charms us. He says things to us. We are a presence.
And we're in on all the plots, right? We're in on all the secret stuff that he's going to do. He shows us, he lets us see when he's having a meeting where he's lying to somebody a whole lot. And then in the car afterward, he'll talk to us about why he had to lie, and this is the way it's done. And you begin to be complicit. It's not quite the same thing as liking, but it does have an element of affection in it. But yeah, it can be hard to articulate because it can be with somebody who, in a second, you would say, if I had the power to stop this person, I would. If I were there and I were a judge and this person were on trial, I would find them guilty, But nonetheless, there is this emotional connection that's caused by the Complicity.
So I saw that, and then I saw the US remake. And it wasn't until I saw the US remake that it really made me think about Complicity. Because in that, he's not talking to the audience. He's not addressing us. And he's not charming. He's just a jerk.
Well,
but I saw that, until I saw that, I never realized that he was charming and that I was charmed by him in the original.
Yeah, charming not in the sense of a handsome prince, but in the sense of successfully, actively trying to charm someone, rolling charisma and rolling a success. The interesting thing when you zoom in on that, and you don't have to have watched either of these shows to understand this, it's very describable. I was in great suspense when I sat down to watch the first episode of the American remake, whether they would have those narrative bits where the character monologues. And the funny answer is they do, but they're totally different even while feeling almost the same. Because in the American version, he monologues as if it's a diary entry, as if he's addressing himself. He remains the center of it, and so you're seeing his inner thoughts poured out not to you, but to himself. And so while it establishes the character in greater detail and makes him a character about whose motives we know much more than we averagely do about an American television program character, because we rarely hear characters in American television programs sit down and say, well, here is exactly how I feel about helping my friend kill vampires every night, right? We don't usually get that. We usually get only a fairly modest amount of self-reflective dialogue. And a lot of emotion is expected to be conveyed in facial expressions or actions. But here we had actual pouring your character out monologue, but it wasn't addressed to me, right? He wasn't explaining to me, his confidant, the viewer, what it was he was doing. He was explaining it as if to himself. And so it was very, very interesting TV writing, and it established a complex character, but he wasn't rolling charisma on me. He was merely being showcased to me. And the difference is tiny but enormous between those two things. And to go back to our Richard III example, although this is actually Henry VI, Part 3, right, there's a moment in there when a bunch of feudy stuff is happening, and one of newly on the throne, King Edward's brothers, George of Clarence, has broken with him and left, and Richard is staying with Edward. Richard has a very brief aside where he says, I stay not for love of Edward, but the crown. And in different productions of Richard III, you can make very different decisions about how you have that tiny aside be given. Is Richard facing the audience? Is Richard talking to himself? You can envision him sort of rubbing his hands and staring at the crown, for example. Does the world freeze? You know, that thing that some theaters do where everything, you know, the lights change and everything turns dark except the character who has the soliloquy and then he says it? Or is it just a tiny moment within it? And most importantly, does he make eye contact with us or not? And in different productions there, because this is very early in Shakespeare's long setup of the character of Richard, we're really getting an establishment of Richard, you can have a very different feel. You know, when he says, I stay not for love of Edward but the crown, wahaha. And Joe, you know, I know you're thinking of the same production I am, but there's a production we're both very fond of by Jane Howell, the BBC Shakespeare Project production from the very early 1980s, in which Richard turns to the camera in this case and says, I stay not for love of Edward, and then he mouths. He doesn't even whisper, he just mouths, but the crown, while pointing at his head where a crown would be and kind of winking at us, you know. I'm doing it not for that, but for this. And it's so exactly like a friend who would be sharing a joke with you about, you know, it's not about the ice cream, it's about the chocolate syrup. Like, it has this wonderful intimacy to it that's so radically different from the Richard you can create with the same words if you do the complicity differently.
And it's also the whispering and doing that. It's taking into account the fact that your audience actually isn't going to be surprised that he's a villain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Everyone in the world is going to be surprised, but he isn't going to be surprised. Or we aren't going to be surprised.
Any plausible audience already knows that Richard III is a bad guy. So taking us into his confidence in that particular way is a great way of making that work. Mm-hmm. I love that production.
So what are some other nifty examples of complicity in narrative that we can think about? I think one of them that's far less subtle and manipulative feeling, because with both House of Cards and Richard III, and to some extent both sides of Coyote Roadrunner, we're dealing with bad people doing bad things. In I, Claudius, in which Claudius, the long and very tired Roman emperor, main character who is both emperor and a historian and is writing a history of his family, is directly addressing posterity, which is us, and has a lot of direct addresses to us. And he's not a villain. Everything he does is either good, scared, or kind of, misledish, imprudent, right? He never does anything evil. The complicity there isn't about the interestingness of getting us into a strange ethical position, but it is about getting us to share his experiences. And I think a big part of what it accomplishes is that a lot of his story is about what it's like to outlive everyone you knew when you were young, what it's like to go through too much history, to go through more events and shifts and changes than it's reasonable for and griefs and tragedies than it's reasonable for a human heart to have to bear. And we start experiencing that with him and empathizing with him and being the only other person who is with him through every step of it and can understand the exhaustion that comes, and how when, in the final years of his life, young, ambitious Romans are doing the same young, ambitious Roman stuff the young, ambitious Romans were doing decades ago, that always ends in fire, that he has seen so many times. And he can't even try to persuade people not to anymore because he knows they just will, or if they don't, other people, he's just tired. We can experience that amazing tired that type of full biography history can do, thanks to having been in a relationship with him. So it feels like we are the friend that experienced this with him, even if we're separated by time.
And because he is talking to us, that he, or the hope of us, the hope of posterity that he is looking to, and that we find ourselves more and more feeling that we owe him something, that we owe him our caring and our attention, and that this is important, that we are at his side.
Because he's been working so hard. His hope is that this history will reach us, so the truth will come out, and the good people will be exonerated and the bad people will be cursed by posterity. And so we are the hope that there can be justice, and therefore feel like we have a duty to help there be justice by consuming this narrative and having feelings about the people that happened. That's us providing justice.
And when I was in university, when I was doing a classics degree, we were doing ancient history, whenever the professor would say anything bad about Claudius, I would want to defend him because I felt like, oh, come on, you're being unfair here. I really felt that he was my friend. That I had a duty to speak up for Claudius.
I remember the first time I saw the big statue that's in the Vatican, which has his head on a obviously not him, like super Herculean bodybuilder body, and it's just like, oh, I'm so sorry. It's embarrassing. And he hated it, and it's just a funny feeling to feel like you know that he hated it. Well, of course, we have no contact with the historical figure. But that, those kinds of connections that complicity generates in that. Jo, you read a really interesting enormous but rarely experienced by a lot of people. People are either in or out of reading romance. What are neat? Can you think of any neat things or unusual things that the romance genre does or doesn't do with questions of complicity?
So in older romance, you never got, or it was incredibly rare for you to get the male point of view. But now it's incredibly rare for you not to get it. So most modern romance novels, whenever they're set, ones that are written now in this century, contemporary, it'll say on the back of the book, will these characters overcome these obstacles to get together? And, this is a question expecting the answer, yes, of course they will, stupid. You read a romance novel, they will. But you are generally alternating points of view of the man and the woman as there are obstacles and as there are things. And you are getting the whole complicity thing of rooting for them. And depending on how well the book is written, how much you actually are rooting for them and how sympathetic you are to the actual obstacles. And I've recently, during the pandemic, I've been reading a lot of romance novels that have the great virtue of being set in Italy. So the quality of these things varies a lot.
You're just getting your vicarious Italy joys.
Absolutely, yes. You read a romance novel set in Italy, and it has this great thing where the characters go to Italy, and then everything is okay. But there will be you can't beat it, but there will be obstacles. And my sympathy with the characters and the obstacles is entirely down to how good the writer is at complicity, how good the writer is at getting me on the side of the characters. I will buy the most ridiculous implausibilities in a novel like this if the author has got me on the character's side.
Mm-hmm.
But if they haven't, I'll be saying, it is absolutely ridiculous to think that the character could be knocked down by a car in Florence. There aren't any cars outside the academia. That's ridiculous. That could never happen. But then other times, there'll be sort of like narrow escapes in fires in vineyards that I'm perfectly okay with, as long as I'm completely hooked on the character's point of view and rooting for them to get to the inevitability of the happy ending.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the arenas in which romance I compare it in my mind a lot with mystery, where there will be a successful end to the romance, and similarly the mystery will be solved and it'll be revealed. It's not going to never be solved. You know that this node has to come at the end. You don't know exactly how, but it means that the excellence of the writer is not showed in coming up with a clever or unexpected ending. The excellence of the writer in a genre like that is how excellently do you stick the landing of the promised thing that was at the beginning. It's sort of like if you're watching gymnastics or ice skating, the difference between, and now the performer is doing their routine where they artistically decided to put together a bunch of different stuff and make something aesthetic and unexpected, versus now they're doing their routine where they have to do these 11 things and they're going to be judged on these 8 criteria, and how excellently they do those 11 things is the heart of what is excellent, which is a different, equally, often, sometimes more impressive performance. Mm-hmm. Being really excellent at completing a formula can be harder than working with less of a formula.
Yes, definitely. But with complicity, I was thinking about the thing that you sort of touched on with I, Claudius, where Claudius is getting the reader, or Graves, I guess, Graves is getting the reader on Claudius's side, to such an extent that you want to do things outside of the book for Claudius. You want to do things for Claudius's memory. You certainly care when, like you said, with seeing the statue. And I think that there are other examples of that sort of thing, but the main ones that I am immediately thinking of are in your work, where you're doing things with where you want the reader to be.
Yeah, I always find it hard to talk about the way I do it, because indeed I modeled it a lot on Iconius, but it's also hard to jump in and talk about something I've constructed myself.
So there are two things that you do without spoilers, or without, bad spoilers. There are two things that you do that are sort of like that I think are really interesting in this context. One is the Richard III thing, where you start off book one by telling us that the narrative will give us enough reasons to hate the narrator, let him not reveal his crimes on page one. And then eventually the reader will get to that.
Yeah, just to frame that slightly more clearly, within the first two paragraphs, the narrator says that he isn't going to tell you who he is because he asks that you let him make you trust him for a few dozen pages, since the tale will give you time enough to hate him in its own right, is the statement. Yes. And so indeed it creates a sort of a sense of intrigue, and it also, like when you watch Richard III for the first time, knowing that Richard is going to be a famous villain but not knowing details, you have that kind of attitude. So autobiographical direct address to the reader is something that we associate with literature of the 18th and 19th centuries, and that we see in the fictitious autobiography of Tristram Shandy. What are other good historical examples other than Diderot, Jo?
Where it's a fake autobiography addressing the reader. I mean, David Copperfield.
Yeah. Well, also, it doesn't have to be an autobiography, but points where they're a direct address to the reader, which we associate broadly with 18th and 19th century literature.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, Trollope will turn around in the middle of any story and tell you what to think. Addressing the reader is something that people do throughout the 19th century in that kind of way. But Dickens specifically does it in his two first-person novels, in David Copperfield and Great Expectations, where he starts off directly talking to the reader in first person about the story that he's going to tell, and doing the complicity thing and getting you on their side, which is why I think that they're Dickens' two most successful novels. Most other 19th century novels, Trollope, Mrs. Gaskell, George Eliot, will address the reader about history and metaphysics and the wider sphere of things that the story is going on in. And Tolstoy does that. I mean, Tolstoy is forever stopping the story to say, if all of the corporals in Napoleon's army had stopped taking orders, then Napoleon's army would never have got to Moscow. And also, he will say things like, I'm sure you felt the joy of reading something and feeling filled with enthusiasm and want to go out and change the world. And then you have found how difficult it is, just as Pierre did, you have found how difficult it is when you get your feet on the ground to try to change the world. Which is something that modern things don't tend to do in the same way.
And in terms of complicity, it's then interesting to think about a lot of that direct address from the author who isn't the narrator tends to communicate things the author cares about. I'm thinking here, for example, of in the middle of Hunchback of Notre Dame, when Victor Hugo goes off on like a 8-page rant about how there used to be stairs up to the front of the cathedral, but then the land level changed and now there aren't stairs, but there used to be stairs. And he cares incredibly deeply that you must know that there were stairs. It is vital to everything that everybody know that there were stairs. And there is no character connected to this at all. It's not as if Quasimodo or Claude Frollo or anyone there cares in any way about these stairs. You know, it's just Victor Hugo, and it's funny, and you remember it, you know.
He's got another one like that where he's talking about the procession and the play, and he sort of suddenly goes off about how you don't get those anymore. They used to have them all the time in the 15th century. Everybody loved them. Why don't we have them now? And, okay, yeah, I'd like it too. Yeah, it would be fun.
Yes. But it's funny, but it doesn't shift your complicity with the characters or sides in a conflict at all. Whereas, if it's a first-person book, let's imagine that in the middle of Claudius had an 8-page rant about how there used to be stairs up to the Temple of Castor, and then Caligula messed it up, and now there aren't stairs up to the Temple of Castor, and he cares very deeply. It would feed into our relationship with Claudius and shift things in a way different from when Victor Hugo does it in its art relationship with Victor Hugo rather than with a character.
It's like the rant in Claudius about the letters, which, Claudius's alphabetical reform, which is like that. And it does do that. I was reading Robert Graves' non-fiction thing about something else, and he started talking about alphabetical reform. And it suddenly, I thought, whoa, Robert Graves cares about alphabetical reform.
It wasn't just the character, yes.
Yeah, that's kind of odd,
what I was going to say is, leading from that then, when you have a character, whether it's a first-person narrator or a character who's speaking, right? Because you could imagine in an adaptation of Hunchback of Notre Dame having a character go off on a long rant about those stairs. That could happen, right? When it addresses the reader and it shows one of these sort of idiosyncrasies where you've learned that the character cares about something, that, weirdly, is a great tool for establishing complicity. And the thing I can compare it to is if you've had, co-workers or people you kind of know around the office or around the department or around the neighborhood, maybe it's neighbors, and you don't really know them very well. They're each individual people, but you wouldn't rank them very differently in how you feel about them. And then, you have a conversation with one of them, and that coworker really opens up about how deeply they care about chinchillas. And you listen to them talk about chinchillas for a while. It creates a connection, and an interesting and emotionally tender connection that we don't think of as a very important relationship forming bridge, but is an important relationship forming bridge. And that's often what an icebreaker is or can be. So that when a character does that, whether as a first-person narrator or in other ways, when a character opens up to you, when a character shows you an idiosyncrasy, when a character does something a little bit embarrassing, right? Going off on an 8-page rant about a thing is a little bit embarrassing. They've trusted you. You've been trusted. They've been intimate with you. And it increases your feeling of you kind of have to reciprocate that trust or you're not being fair-ish. It may not be a conscious feeling, but on a number of different levels, that kind of display of an idiosyncrasy increases your emotional connection to that figure. Even if it's just that moment when Richard mouthed to us, "I may stay not for love of Edward, but the crown," right? It's parallel. I'm not very interested in this building, except for the stairs. You gotta hear about the stairs. It creates a moment of personal connection. And in much of Too Like the Lightning, where I have my first-person narrator use the common 18th and 19th century method of interjecting within the narrative, talking about things that the narrator cares about, things the narrator thinks or feels, things the narrator thinks you, dear reader, will think, and, defends people and hopes that you'll be considerate, etc. Completely irrespective of whether this character is a criminal, as you know from the beginning, even if I had, the simplest, most huggable kindergarten teacher in the world use that type of narrative, by being a little bit tender and open with you, by showing idiosyncrasies, by having moments where they have to depict someone they care about being bad, and then they say, oh, I hope you won't be harsh on X, because X really is a good person, and I know they look bad at this point, whether it's, little Billy who is in the kindergarten, or whether it's, a president, whoever it is being described. When people do that, ask you a little bit of trust, care about your opinion, worry about it, and have that intimacy, that is enormously effective at developing complicity. In many ways, I think of it as the text-only version of the moment when the Roadrunner catches your eye on camera in the Roadrunner cartoon. It's the moment that the narration, the director has pushed you into having a connection with this character more so than you would if it were just the events. And that's something that can be done in direct first-person narration, or can be done in third person or anything by revealing these moments of a character, but is very effective in first person when the character who's being explored cares about the reader's opinion. And that is the power that is wielded by Richard III and I, Claudius, and House of Cards, all three very directly. The us knowing that he cares what we think.
Yes, that is very, very powerful and very effective. Yeah. And that is quite different from the general direct address that you get, even when Tolstoy is saying, you have felt this, reader. It's not because it's not a character. It might make you feel sympathetic with Tolstoy, but it doesn't really make you feel that the character is opening up to you in that same kind of way.
Well, and I think opening up or being candid or dropping barriers is another key to it. Because, the thing that is endearing about Victor Hugo's 8-page rant about stairs is that it's such a silly thing to put in there that it's sort of adorable. That you're just such a good writer, you thought through every other thing in this book, but here you just cared so much you let your passion run away with you, and we saw a little bit of the unguarded underbelly, right? We saw the intimate self is what it feels like when that kind of choice is made. It's like the first time you see somebody that you've always seen sort of very put together. There's a fire alarm in the middle of the night and they come out into the dorm hallway in their pajamas, and the pajama pattern is something hilarious and unexpected and endearing, right? And it doesn't even matter what it is. It doesn't matter whether it's atoms or axolotls. It creates a moment of, I didn't think about that person that way before, and I've had a moment of unguardedness, and it increases the sense of intimacy between the two figures. That it's not quite the same thing as embarrassment, because embarrassment makes you wish the person didn't have to go through this, right? It inspires pity. Whereas you don't pity Victor Hugo for giving you an 8-page rant about these stairs. You're just like, aw, he really, really cares. That's kind of sweet. And that kind of candidness, when we, the reader or viewer, are shown a thing where the other person is their guard down, that the barriers have dropped, breaks the ice and creates a kind of an intimacy and a two-way, or a feeling of having to reciprocate that trust that is warm. I think that's one of the key characteristics of it, is that it's warm. There are many moments in which a villain can be doing a dastardly thing. In our black and white evil railroad, the railroad is coming through and we must steal it, silent film era villain with his twirly mustache. He can come out to the stage and show you his dastardly equipment and lay out his dastardly plan, and he's showing it to you. But you don't necessarily kind of empathize with him, unless there's a particularly charming moment when he catches your eye and really makes eye contact and smiles, and you see the glee in that smile. it can be one way or the other. A villain can show you a thing, a character can show you a thing without a connection. But when there is a connection, it can create a very special kind of warmth that's quite a bit different from.
Yes, I think the warmth is the key to it in all of these examples where you do feel the complicity. It is a warmth,
Mm-hmm.
and that is quite different from most of the sort of 19th century direct address to the reader stuff.
Which tends to be grand or grave, or I'm going to try to make you sympathize with the plight of the impoverished people. Here I'm going to try to make you feel nostalgic for something lost, or grieved that this thing is gone. I want to persuade you to this political thing. It's very performative. It's very like the author going up and making a speech about the thing, or writing an op-ed about the thing. That is very polished and very intentional and very calculated. And even if the language is casual, even if the degree of formality of the language in Hugo's rant about stairs and in Hugo's discussion of the division of Paris into 3 parts with the island, the college, and the church stuff on the other bank, are equally formal. The prose is the same, but because the discussion of the division of the city of Paris serves the plot and serves your understanding and gets across ideas about history and politics and is formal and important, it feels polished, and it feels like, Hugo fully dressed in his suit going into work and doing his speech about this thing. When it's the 8-page rant about stairs, it really feels like you've caught him a little off guard and gotten him to go off the rails onto something that, when he's calmer later, he'll realize probably actually wasn't worthy of an entire half-hour lecture in the middle of class. And it makes you chuckle, and it makes you feel warm, because it is uncalculated and spontaneous, and the character / author is perhaps, would be a little embarrassed by it and kind of hope for your sympathy with it. Even if they don't directly ask, please, dear reader, indulge me as I go on about stairs for 8 pages. They don't ask that, but you still are aware that if they look back on it, they'll want to beg your indulgence. And so you feel indulgent, which is a warm feeling.
Yes, it's very different from saying it is a truth universally acknowledged. To go on your little rant about stairs. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Truth universally acknowledged there used to be 8 stairs here. See, if he'd begun the book like that, it would have been...
yes. Very different book.
Hard to pull off. I'm not going to say automatically unsuccessful. I think an excellent writer could make it work, but it would have been a challenge in a lot of ways.
I was just going to say, you've been writing introductions to Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun recently, and that might be an interesting bit of complicity to talk about.
Yeah, Book of the New Sun is interesting. It was interesting on reread because it has a very complex narrator who is indeed directly addressing the reader. And as we advance through this story of how a very medium-ish, lowish status apprentice torturer ends up eventually becoming a far more important figure in his society, it involves, him doing things that we from our 20th or now 21st century judgment consider to be terrible things. And sometimes describing them defensively and explaining, why he did the thing. But also sometimes not explaining them defensively, just assuming we would never think that doing X was bad. And it's neat seeing, we learn a lot about him and his society from which things we don't like he seems to feel he has to justify to us, that he expects someone from his own culture to also not like, and which ones he explains as if it's perfectly normal and there's a mismatch. So he reflects a lot, for example, on people's attitudes toward there being a torturer's guild and toward execution and painful execution being things that are used in his culture. And on how, this is the reason that it's necessary, and these are the ways that it goes wrong, and these are the attitudes people have, and here are the ways that it's useful for people to have negative attitudes toward it and feel, negative toward people associated with torturers, even if the society actually benefits from it. The society also benefits from culturally condemning it because it makes people feel in their hearts negative feelings about murder and about causing of pain. So he reflects a lot on that. But there will be other points of abandoning people in need who he feels have been bad, where we feel upset that he abandoned that person. He doesn't defend himself. And we learn so much about him from the absence of what would have been a tender moment of him being embarrassed and defending himself. And there are a couple of striking moments where he does defend himself, and one that I'm remembering quite vividly in which he says I don't remember whether he says it's the only or one of extremely few moments that he can remember that he actively regrets. But he talks about it as this quick blip moment of regret. Whereas to us, it was, I think, more horrible than that. But it's also interesting to see him have not zero guilt, but not what we would consider normal guilt. He has like 5% guilt compared to what we would expect. And the net result of this teaches us a lot about the world, teaches us a lot about him, but doesn't tend to make us feel warm toward him. Because the places where he's defending himself don't feel like embarrassment. They feel like self-presentation and protection of reputation, or even working to justify to himself something that he feels guilty about. And I think one of the interesting cores there is that there's practically no point at which he ever tries hard to defend the actions of somebody else that he's worried we'll dislike. One of the things that can make us feel tender towards someone is when we see that person working hard to defend their friend, working hard to defend a kid, working hard to try to protect from embarrassment or negative judgment or misunderstanding, not themselves, just somebody they care about. Because that's a moment of demonstrating empathy, demonstrating caring, demonstrating that they feel warmly toward their friends and try to defend them as we would try to defend our friends who we feel warm about. But Severian doesn't have very many close friendships, and the ones that we do see him have don't tend to have moments like that. And so it's interesting to me to observe it as a sequence where there is very complex complicity, and he's describing this path, and we are with him on the path journeying along. We know that the path is leading to power in a complex way that we gradually come to understand. We walk that path with him, but that path remains extremely centered on him and his desires, and then the whole world and the whole world's needs, with very few moments where it's about his relationship with a friend. There are quite a few moments that are about his sexual relationship with a woman, many of which feel a little dated enough to be uncomfortable, but even the ones that are more positive, somebody's sexual relationship with a woman doesn't have that innocent friendship-building warmth that somebody's dynamic with a friend does, or often it doesn't. Some depictions of romance can also have many elements of friendship in it, but the ones there tend not to. And it's very interesting to see how his reflections on romantic and sexual partners don't generate the kind of warmth that I feel characters' reflections on. Jo, did you have thoughts on Severian?
Yeah, I was going to say that you do often actually get that thing where a sexual partner is a friend and where somebody is protective towards a sexual partner in that exact way. In fiction, you often do see that as a very positive thing, but you certainly don't in Book of the New Sun.
Yes.
And you don't in Severian. I think that is a very definite choice that Woolf was making there, not to make those relationships friendships in addition to being sexual romantic relationships.
It preserves a kind of coldness to the reader's relationship with Severian as we watch this journey, in which every time we find him justifying himself, we turn on our judgment hat and, okay, should we be going along with this justification or should we be critical of this justification? Which is very different from Claudius, where rapidly we feel so warm toward him that when he gives his justifications for, going along with bad stuff or imprudent choices that have bad consequences, our reaction to his explanation of why he did the thing isn't to put on our critical judgment hat. It's to say, he meant so well and he was doing so well, but, that's so unfortunate. Not, that was a bad choice and a cause for bad judgment. So very different how Gene Wolfe versus Robert Graves invite us to feel about their enormously powerful rising to power from nothing protagonists when they justify to us different things that they have done with their power or before it. Because the paths are extremely parallel in a lot of ways, and yet the relationship that each author has chosen to have us develop with the narrator is so different in its degree of warmth, even while both involve a lot of complicity in many ways. I think one of the other things that makes the complicity possibility with Severian complex is that one of the things that helps develop complicity between the reader and a character is when the character is showing us all the secret stuff, right? The character is showing us, here is my dastardly plan to defeat my enemies. The character is showing us, here is where I have hid the Acme TNT bomb to get the Roadrunner with. The character is telling us the plan, a good plan, a bad plan. It can be the character sharing with us the secret feelings of affection they have for a beloved that they haven't had the courage to confess to. Or it can be the Roadrunner coming up behind Wile E. Coyote, seeing that there's a cliff and catching our eye and winking. Those are all about shared knowledge. And there are a lot of moments in Book of the New Sun when Severian hides stuff from us and doesn't even really address that he's hiding stuff from us. He'll jump over events. He'll be on his way to a place and then we'll be leaving the place and fleeing the city. And we're like, why are we fleeing? You skipped something. Are you going to tell us the thing you skipped? Why are you skipping the thing? The thing was clearly important. What's going on? And he makes us wait a long time to get any kind of satisfaction on that. And he never tells us, dear reader, here is why I'm skipping this. Dear reader, here is why we're going in this weird order. Dear reader, here is why I'm giving you A before B. And so when we get, or rather, why I'm giving you B before A. And so when we get B before A and are distracted and alarmed by that, it distances us a bit from Severian. That, not that he gave it to us out of order, but that he didn't reflect on the fact that this would cause the reader distress. I think we need the term micro-distress here, right? Because it's not that you're upset on a vast level that we skipped over the explanation or doing the flight first, the explanation afterward. But it is a bit perplexing, and the reader has been forced to do extra work to track on what's going on. And there isn't a moment of the narrator saying, oh, dear reader, I will explain in a minute what happened, but what happened requires me to explain this long other thing. And I know you really want to see what happens to this character, So I'm going to describe the flight because that'll give us resolution for this character. And then I'll go back and give you the long explanation that leads to the other thing. If he did that, we would increase our complicity with and a warmth with him. And the fact that he didn't, and we hunger for it, and he's making us do this work himself, and he's not helping, is like, if you come up to a door and your arms are full of boxes that somebody asked you to carry for them, and then he doesn't hold the door for you. Come on, man. Give us that little bit to make this slightly easier. And so Gene Wolfe, by doing this, strategically distances us from Severian, and often does it right after moments when we've felt extra close to Severian. Right after there's been something that's extra empathetic or extra human. The particular example I'm thinking of where it jumps to out of order is right after a moment when he literally helps starving orphans. And our feelings of positiveness toward him have increased by seeing him help starving orphans. And so Gene Wolfe is carefully reintroducing a coldness and a kind of judgment because he doesn't want us to ever stop judging Severian and thinking carefully and critically and analytically about Severian. But if instead Severian had just done something else that is off-putting, if we had, for example, just seen Severian practicing the torturer's art and we're in a moment of bleh, that is a moment we'll often follow it with a very, reader, I realize I should have explained this thing, or I realize I have an obligation to tell you this thing, but I can't tell you this thing yet, or, I've sworn a sacred oath not to reveal the secrets of something, and I know that eventually, someday, I will break that oath, but we're not there yet, so I want to keep it as long as I can. And those moments where the narrator is addressing the fact that he's done something that's extra work for the reader, that makes the reader do labor, that makes the reader experience micro pain, increases warmth and complicity instead of creating coldness and distance. And so throughout Shadow of the Torturer, you see Gene Wolfe using these very strategically to create distance and judgment. Throughout I, Claudius, you see Robert Graves, in fact, usually avoiding it because he wants us to be 100% on Claudius's side. And similarly, again, and this is one of the places where Terra Ignota is strongly influenced by both of this. I also think very carefully about this whenever I have the narrator do something that is difficult for the reader. The narrator almost always talks about it and talks about why. To the degree that when eventually there are points when there's a weird jump or something out of order and the narrator doesn't talk about why, you now know the narrator's narrative style well enough to know something must be wrong. Something must be wrong enough with the narrator to make him not do that, because normally he would never do that to you, his friend that he cares about, without explaining it. And if that explanation is wanting, that is a sign of distress in someone you know well. Like someone walking into the room with their eyes puffy and something is wrong even when you don't know what it is yet. Which is something that I can only cultivate very gradually by having many instances before that of points at which the narrator asks the reader to do something hard and directly addresses the fact that he's doing something hard. And so then it turns into a tool where the narration itself, in the moments that it skips that, help communicate to you that something weird and scary has happened, even before you start to get the description that something weird and scary has happened, because the narrator is exhibiting signs of distress.
And so you can't do that until the later volumes.
Right, because you have to know the narrator well to understand it. You can do it on reread in the earlier volumes. You can do it so that the reader who has read all these books once and is reading them a second time can tell that the narrator is distressed at X moment. But you can't have it on your first level reader be perceptible. So you can't have the reader's understanding of the chapter hinge on it. Whereas in later books where the reader knows the narrator well, or even late in the first book, you can have the reader's, even first-time reader's experience of a chapter really hinge on realizing at the very beginning that something enormously impactful must have happened because the narrator is doing this and isn't giving you his caring, empathetic explanation of why there's been a jump.
Fascinating.
Yeah, all these different tools that Complicity gives you.
We've mostly been talking about things that are in first person or that are theatre.
Mm-hmm.
And things that are in the kind of form of Omni where it's a special form of first person, really. It's a omniscient first person telling the story, 19th century.
Right, like Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo is sort of writing in Omni in that he can see any character do anything, but it's Victor Hugo and his own opinions that are shaping the story. So it's a first-person narrator who never uses the first person, in a sense, but who has a very strong presence and has opinions and a personality. You did a great explanation of this at one point, talking about the opening sentence of Pride and Prejudice, and how that it must be agreed by everybody that
it's a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife.
Right. Yeah. There is an enormous amount of information about social class.
Yeah, the world building in that sentence.
Right, the social class of the perspective that is saying this. And there isn't a first person pronoun in the sentence, but nonetheless, there is an enormous amount of information you now know about that Omni narrator. And in contrast with It Was a Dark and Stormy Night, where you know nothing about the social class or personality or ties or opinions of the narrator, you just know that it's a dark and stormy night. That sentence is in sort of true Omni, where there isn't a first-person Omni personality. Whereas the Pride and Prejudice opening sentence, there is a personality to the omniscient view that is moving around. But you were gonna...
I did a thing in Tooth and Claw, which is a sentimental Victorian novel about dragons who eat each other. And it is written in full trollop mid-19th century Omni with a first-person Omni narrator. And in that book, I knew perfectly well as me that my readers were humans. But the narrator of the story knew perfectly well that her readers were dragons. So I could do a lot of fun things within that space of Complicity, where I could have her earnestly assuring her readers not to be distressed because this was not cooked meat that they were consuming. Don't be upset, reader. This was not cooked meat. Where I knew perfectly well that my actual genuine readers were not upset about cooked meat. But similarly, that there were things where I knew my actual readers would be really upset, like cannibalism. Whereas she, the narrator thought that was all well and good. And that you should be approving of the cannibalism, but shocked by the cooked meat. So I could actually do things with the space of expectation of people's the people are used to reading an Omni narrator in a particular way, so that then I could turn around towards the end of the book and say, gentle reader, and then say, because I know you are a gentle reader, not the kind of reader who hangs around outside editorial offices ready to eat the author if the author has displeased them. And suddenly you, the reader, thought you knew where you were, and in a way, you were not there.
Right.
And I really, really like the ability to do that with where you put the reader in relation to the story.
Mm-hmm. And how different that is from something that is straightforwardly in, hopping around third Omni without a character and personality and set of expectations being transparently visible. I think one of the neat things, because genre fiction and historical fiction are usually where you see that done. And me as a historian, what I always feel there is that it's mimicking the effect of reading something from a different time period. Because when we read something that was written in the 18th century that's trying desperately to persuade us, for example, that it's possible for farmers to learn to read or something.
Yeah.
We don't need to be persuaded of this, but the effort of the author to persuade us of this is fascinating. And is much of what is delicious to a historian about looking at documents from another era, which don't try to persuade us of the stuff we need to be persuaded of. It tries to persuade the expected audience of what the author thinks they need to be persuaded of. And so what you're doing in Tooth and Claw, and what is one of the treasures of a thoroughly thought through genre book that's set in a time and place that isn't our time and place, is when it does think through, okay, and someone writing a book in this culture expects X to be true of the reader and is wrong. And there's going to be one of these delicious historical mismatches. And those delicious historical mismatches can be, doing interesting things with ethics. You can have the text clearly expect the reader to be horrified at people eating carrots, which kills the plant, instead of only eating cloned vegetables, and we've jumped into a different ethical headspace. Or it could be the other way around, where there can be a weird foreigner who doesn't understand why we have cannibalism, and everyone in the story can be making fun of them and being weirded out by this person who doesn't understand cannibalism. And both of those are very interesting, neat moments that put the reader in a funny place in terms of what the narrative is doing, that feel exactly like reading a historical document or a work of literature from another time, especially one that tries to persuade or judge. Another type of arena that I think it'd be fun to talk about, Complicity. In mysteries, there will often be a moment where a particular character knows a piece of information. And we, the reader, know that that character knows that piece of information. But for some reason, only that character knows it. They haven't told it, or they can't reveal it, or no one will believe them. And, Complicity is often, we know that the Roadrunner is setting up the thing. We know that Richard is scheming. But in mystery, it can work in an enormous range of different ways. And I think there are lots of very interesting cases in mystery where it might be that the person is the only person who realizes that it wasn't just a regular killer, it was a supernatural killer. And only this person saw the evidence of something supernatural happening, but in a way that they can't prove it and they don't dare say so because people will believe them. And it creates a different relationship between them and us from when it's someone who, saw that the killer got away in a particular type of van, but isn't revealing it because their friend owns a van that looks like that and they want to protect their friend. There are lots of different moments in mysteries when we have a shared piece of knowledge with a character that can sometimes increase or decrease sympathy, or complicity, or not. And I wonder if you can think, Jo, of a couple of neat moments of that type of shared knowledge between reader and character.
Specifically, what I was starting to think about as you were saying that, which is kind of interesting because it's third person, unlike everything else we've been talking about, is C.J. Cherryh's sighting, where there is a murder towards the beginning of the book, and the vast majority of the book is people making a clone of the murdered woman and trying to bring her up in as close a way as possible so that she will be as close as possible to the murdered woman. And eventually she finds out that her predecessor was murdered. And she thinks, will they do that to me like they've done everything else? But prior to that point, we have absolutely known that she was murdered the whole time. And we've been watching this character not know. And so we've been waiting for that for that moment of her finding that out for like hundreds of pages. Where you never can quite forget it, even when it's not danced past you in the way that these things so often are. That sooner or later she's gonna know that, as well as finding out what's been done to her in all that.
I wonder that creates, it's not complicity as much as it creates a kind of empathy or sympathy where we realize that the character is in a sense deprived of a kind of power, where the kind of power that, knowledge of this fact, in as much as knowledge is power, being deprived of knowledge of this fact is a disempowerment of the character, in a sense that they might act differently at different points. And we know that that person has been deprived of this power, which we have and others have, and we don't have the ability to give the character, but which we will then sympathize with the character not having, even though the character doesn't know that they have been stripped of this power. And so it increases our sympathy, which isn't quite the same thing as complicity, but can be used to help develop complicity.
I think that there is another complicity thing in Citeen, which is the question of whether we would bring back the murdered woman, whether we would do that. And the kid is sympathetic, but the murdered woman is terrible. And I mean, I think that is one of the great questions is where our complicity is with the people who are recreating her life and getting her back. But this is a long way from your proper mystery example.
So in the first episode of the anime mystery Paranoia Agent, which is a brilliant suspense mystery thriller series by Satoshi Kon, we don't know yet whether something supernatural is happening, and we don't even know yet whether the supposed assailant exists, because the opening setup of the mystery is that there is a woman. She's a character designer who creates mascot characters. She's in a period of great pressure and stress, and then a mysterious assailant hits her over the head in the middle of a parking lot at night. And because she's been attacked by an assailant and is in the hospital, there's news about her, everyone pities her, it gets her out of a lot of the pressures and the deadlines and the people bugging her, and it sort of fulfills all of her desperate wishes and need to escape from the stress. And then the detective's question is, did that really happen? Was there really an assailant? Or did she just hit herself on the head with something and claim it in order to get out of it? And the questioning in that very first episode is so intense, and she's so hard to communicate with, that for a while you as the viewer / reader are uncertain whether she knows. It seems like she isn't sure whether there was really an assailant or whether she really made it up. Whether she was so stressed that she did this and Semi doesn't remember, and there's a witness who claims to have seen it and that there was no one, and it's unclear what happened, and it really looks like maybe there wasn't an assailant. But then the very end of the episode, a different character ends up in the same, and remember, this is only 20 minutes of narrative, a different character ends up in the same over-the-top level of stress she was in. And she is in the same parking lot when he is there, And the same assailant, very recognizable, comes and hits him, and grants his wish in exactly the same way that her wish had been granted, and then stops right in front of her for a second and looks at her, and we see this assailant clearly for the first time and how exactly it matches the sketch she made for the police. And then he just quietly says, "Tadaima," which is, "I'm home." It's the thing you say when you come home from work or school, the normal, everyday thing you say to family when you arrive. And he has this grin on his face, and then he moves on. And the way it's done, it's so very clearly the arrival of something that isn't right and that is connected to her, and she knows it. And we don't understand it. It's still vague and amorphous at the edge of things. But from that moment, we know something is rotten in Denmark, right? We know that something is weirder than it seems. And we know that she's the only other one who sees it. And it creates a neat connection with her, who's otherwise a quite cold and off-putting character in a lot of ways, that makes us, it doesn't make us very sympathetic with her, but it makes us connect to her more. And then much of the next sequence of it is other people gradually coming to realize that this is bigger and stranger than it seemed. And our sympathy and empathy shifting each time another person comes into that small envelope, which at the beginning contains only us and her, of people who've realized that this is big and not normal. And every time a character makes that shift, we feel a very powerful connection to that character that wasn't there before. Powerful and different. All right, well, this has been a fun discussion of Complicity, which I'm sure we'll also discuss many times in our many other conversations. And I hope that for people listening, you had an enjoyable sample of two authors who really geek out over the craftsmanship of narrative and love to talk about structure and point of view and exact function of different subtle narrative tricks, and can easily have, as we have had, a 3-hour conversation about crafting the ending sentence of a chapter or the first sentence of the next chapter.
I think we should do that,
yeah, we could definitely do one about that. But I hope you've enjoyed this, and it gives you a good taste of the kinds of delving deep into narrative, but also history and other things that we will do with each other, and also with a variety of guests in future episodes. See you in future episodes, everyone.
This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives International 4.0 license.
And you can support us and get episodes in advance at patreon.com/Ada Palmer, and support Jo and get her wonderful poetry at patreon.com/BlueJo.
And you can find us on Twitter and our books and things at jowaltonbooks.com and adapalmer.com. So, until next time, ex Urbe ad Astra.
Ad Astra.